In Python, negative indexing allows you to access elements from the end of a collection, such as a list or string, using negative numbers. Negative indexing is useful when you want to access elements of a sequence from the end without knowing the exact length of the sequence. The last element of a sequence always has an index of -1, and the second to last element always has an index of -2, and the third to last element always has an index of -3, so on and so forth. This pattern continues. So let's look at an example of negative indexing. So we know positive indexing or zero-based indexing works in this fashion. The first item in the sequence is given the index 0. The second item in the sequence is given the index 1. The third item in the sequence is given the index 2. And the fourth item in the sequence is given the index 3. Now with negative indexing, the last element in the sequence is always given the index -1. And the second to last is given the index -2. And the third to last is given the index -3. And the fourth to last is given the index -4. So let's go ahead and write down all of the indexes. So Python gives you the option of accessing elements from a sequence using either zero-based indexing or negative-based indexing. So you can do one or the other. So let's go ahead and using negative indexing, let's access items from list of fruits. So go ahead and write our list of fruits, and we'll use index notation as usual, and we'll put -1. And let's go ahead and print this out. And let's go ahead and run this. So as you can see, we see cherry. Next, let's go ahead and print out the third to last item. So we'll do list of fruits, and we'll do index -3. Let's go ahead and run this, and we see apple. Next, let's print out the fourth to last item. So that should be orange. Let's go ahead and run this. And we see orange. So let's go ahead and add another item to list of fruits. So here I'll add watermelon. So remember that the last item in the sequence is always given the index -1. So cherry will no longer have the -1 index. Now watermelon will have it. So let's go ahead and update this and shift everything over. Let's go ahead and fix the spacing a bit. Okay. And this is because watermelon has the -1 index because it's the last item. And because cherry is the second to last item, is given the index -2. And because banana is the third to last item, is given the index -3. So on and so forth. And if we were to run this again, you'll see that we now see watermelon. And if I were to remove watermelon, we would need to shift all of this back again. And if I ran this, cherry will now have the index -1. So it is important to note that the index -1 always represents the last element, regardless of the length of the sequence. If you add items to the sequence or remove items from the sequence, -1 will always be given to the last item in the sequence. A good time to use negative indexing is anytime you want the x to last item in a sequence, because the index of that item will always be -x. And let me actually write this down. So a good time to use negative indexing is anytime you want the X to last item in the sequence because the index of that item will always be -x. And what this essentially is saying is that if you want the third to last item from a sequence, then the index will just be -3. And if you want the last item in the sequence, then it would just be -1. And if you wanted the fifth to last item in the sequence, then the index would just be -5. So we can also use negative indexing with strings as well. So let's create a string and we'll assign it to the variable greeting. And let's say good morning. So let's access the second to last item from this string. And we know that the second to last item should just be G. So let's go ahead and print that out. And we'll put -2. Let's go ahead and run this. And we see G. Next, let's print out the last item in the sequence. And we'll use -1. Let's go ahead and run this. And we get the exclamation mark. Now, when using indexing, one thing to keep in mind is that if you use an index that isn't a valid index in the sequence, this will result in an index error. So let's illustrate this with an example. First, let's go ahead and take the length of greeting. So I'll create a variable called length, and I'll assign it to taking the length of greeting. Let's go ahead and run this. Oh, looks like I forgot to print this out. So let's print this out first. And let's run this again. So here we see 13. So that means that this sequence has 13 characters. So let's say I wanted to access the -15th index of this sequence. Well, I know that that's not going to exist because this string does not even have 15 characters. So if the string doesn't have 15 characters, then there's no way that I can say, I want the 15th to last item because there isn't 15 characters. So let's go ahead and run this. And you'll see here that we have an error. And we have an index error. And an index error typically happens when you're trying to access an item using indexing, but that index does not exist. This same thing also applies when we're using zero-based indexing. So let's see this with an example. So if I do greeting, and say I try to access the element at index 17, this also should not work because this sequence does not have 17 characters. So there's no way that I can access the element at index 17. So let's go ahead and comment this out, and let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, we get an index error. And this also means that the index that we're trying to access does not exist. So be mindful of that when you're using indexing to access elements from either a list or a string. And whether you're using zero-based indexing or negative indexing, the index that you use must be valid. And just remember that negative indexing is very useful when you want to access items from the end of a sequence. And zero-based indexing is very useful when you want to access items from the beginning of a sequence. So that essentially wraps up negative indexing.